Okay, good morning everyone. So this talk is called Create the Right Product, and the other part of the title of the talk is what happens before wireframing. So Carl and I will take you through that, and I think where we'll start is just by talking about creating products. What things might we think about when we're doing that, and also what does a good product, what might a good product look like? What the right product, what does that actually mean? And then we'll take you into some stories. We've got two slightly different stories from our work, which hopefully will illustrate to you some of these things that we're talking about. And then at the very end, we will very briefly show some techniques that you can potentially either use yourself or get somebody else to do. And at the very end, there'll be a chance at some questions. Okay. Anyone feeling like they're in the wrong talk? No? You can't? Okay. Yeah, before we begin, actually, because I'm a researcher, I just love to start with some questions. So my questions that I want to begin with are, have you ever been in this situation? So you didn't really know enough to start building or coding something, but you did it, you started it anyway. Has anyone ever been in this situation? Okay. That's quite a few people, okay? So we don't really know enough about what we're doing, but we just get on with it anyway, okay? That's the first warning bell. Okay, how about this one? So the product turned out differently to what you thought it was when you started. So you end up with something different. Yep, one at the back. Oh, yes, okay. Okay. I mean, just out of interest, how many people here consider themselves sort of coders, coding stuff, and how many sort of don't do that, they do something else? Okay. Okay. Last one. That's it. Ever wasted time on crap projects? Okay. Anyone, never had this problem? No. Yeah, it does. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll perhaps see what crap means potentially. Although I think we probably all know that. Okay. And then lastly, why do you do this stuff? Why do you code or build tech products? You don't have to actually call this out. But just have a think to yourself, like, why'd you do it? And then, so maybe paying the mortgage or the rent. But what else? What else do you get from doing this stuff? Just have a little think about that, because we'll see that actually creating the right product potentially is going to improve on whatever the reason you do this is. Okay, I think I'll hand you over to Carl now. And he'll talk about creating a product. So, Carl.
All right, thanks. So yeah, we're going to be tag teaming this a bit. Good morning, Bristol. I always wanted to say that. I'm in a good mood today. Hopefully you're in a good mood today. I think we're hopefully going to have some fun. Dave kind of set it up. So creating a song, moving right along. So a recent conversation I had with someone locally, they kind of described their process, right? We get a brief, and then we do what the brief says. We execute it, right? Pretty typical. So what are the risks of doing this, right? Why would you possibly not do this, right? The brief might be based on sort of someone's got a product idea, maybe there's a bit of market research, some technical feasibility, but we're kind of implying that potentially this might not be the best way to start a project. So context, if you're working on something that's smaller, a variation, a new page, some different way of doing something on a website or what have you, there's a lot of established techniques to kind of testing that. A/B, there's a bunch of others. A/B, there's a bunch of others. That's actually pretty straightforward. I think what we're talking about today is a situation where you're creating a brand new product, it's from the ground up, maybe something like this doesn't exist or you don't have anything with it. So A/B testing is going to be a lot trickier, right? So where do you start? Before we get into kind of like where we're suggesting you start, I kind of want to walk you through a couple factors of like, why are we suggesting this, right? So one big, huge thing that we're thinking about is, what's the total cost of ownership of this product over its lifetime? So you got the brief, I don't know, maybe it's a $50K job, $100K job, whatever it is, but when you actually think about what that product is going to cost in entirety, it is far more than that contract you're looking at, right? So these are just some of the things that have to be done. Design, engineering, QA, marketing and sales, documentation, staging and rollout, maintenance, training, support. I mean, each one of these actually has a team, an expertise, time, cost, money, right? So you may be looking at a brief that doesn't seem that big, but when you look at the overall cost, you know, this might represent, it's hard to say, it depends on the project, but it could be a year or two of effort, the lifespan of the project. This is a lot of people, a lot of time, and a lot of money. So when you're looking at that brief, you're really just looking at the tip of the iceberg. And so when we kind of get to our suggestions, this is one of the big reasons we're suggesting you maybe take a bit more time right at the beginning. Early changes are cheap. There's a great quote from Frank Lloyd Wright here. It's easier to change something on the plan than when it is built, right? I mean, I think we all know this, we've seen it. You know, changing requirements, free, easy, cheap, but once the thing is built, it is not easy or cheap to change it. You've got users, you've got documentation, you've got training, it just becomes a huge freight train that is hard to turn around. So given that the total cost is fairly high and late changes are expensive, you know, what if your brief is wrong, right? I mean, both of these products cost millions and millions of dollars to develop. I don't know, 20, 50, 100 million to roll out a new phone? Well, we know how this story ends, right? One of these is a lot better than the other. And sure, there are a lot of factors beyond just the brief. I'm not trying to oversimplify, but the point is, if you're going to spend that money and time developing a product, get the brief right, right? Start in the right place. It is worth your time. Again, context setting. So there's lots and lots of techniques around development process. I just threw up a couple on the screen. We are not covering all of these today. We're talking about design research. It actually happens generally before all this in the requirements phase. But just to be clear, I'm not dismissing these. I think one of the reasons we wanted to talk about design research today is that often, in my experience, clients just skip that process entirely and move straight into something else. So this is sort of like, hey, here's an opportunity to do something early on that can have a huge benefit. Not to ignore these, we're just not talking about them today. So with that, I'm gonna hand back over to Dave.
So yeah, so design research. Carl's just mentioned it there. It's kind of a thing. It's a thing that you get to do, or you can do, or maybe you don't do. But this is what we want to talk about today. And really, I guess it's a bit hard to pin down, but the objective of it is to remove assumptions. And I'll tell you a bit more about what I mean by this as we go through. So perhaps it'd be helpful if I say, well, this is what it is, and this is what it isn't. And then I'll maybe take you into an example so you can start to sort of get a sense of it. So what is it, this design research thing? So perhaps Carl and I might be doing this. In fact, I'm doing this at the moment for a client of mine. What is it that I really do? And I guess what I really do is I spend my time listening and observing and understanding what the world is like, I guess. And it's great fun. I mean, God, my job is like the most interesting thing that I think I could actually do. So it's about trying to understand the real world, I guess, and to discover what the real problem is. So if, for example, you're making, I don't know, like the conference speaker relationship management system that was just mentioned. Let's say we're making something like that. What is the real problem that actually speakers have? You know, it may be a little more subtle than on the face of it what we think it is. And this is why we get into these situations that I was talking about before about, well, do you really know enough to actually get started? Does it turn out differently to what you thought it was when you began? You know, this is why we get these issues, because actually the real problem is often slightly different to what we think the problem is. So perhaps the brief comes from some business initiative, some potential gap in the market for the product, but then, you know, is the brief complete, as Carl mentioned? So perhaps the brief isn't quite on the actual problem that we need to solve. So I'll tell you a bit more about that. But just to be clear, what we're saying design research isn't is perhaps something that's also helpful to look at. So we're not saying this is sort of doing an MVP. And it's not wireframing, it's not coding, and it's not testing. This is stuff that we're saying we can do before any of this typical work that we just launch into because somebody says, let's build this thing. I've got the money. Let's do it. You know, you've got the skills. Let's just spend the money, right? You know. So this is kind of like saying, hold on a minute. Let's just slow down and let's really try and understand what it is we're supposed to be doing. I'll tell you a bit more about that. So just before I do, though, it's understanding how people are going to relate to your design in the world. Okay, so this is kind of quite a key point. If we build something in this room right now using our laptops, it's going to go out there into the world and people are going to use it. But we need to think about the world that it's going to go into, okay? And I'll tell you a bit more about that. So here's just like an example that I talk about all the time. So what is this? Can anyone recognize what this is? Italian cafe. Have I told you this story? No. Italian cafe. Yeah. Okay, so what are people doing here?
Adding sugar to their espresso.
Adding sugar.
That's what they tend to do.
Yeah. They're drinking coffee. It's amazing, isn't it? So but they're not just drinking coffee. They're actually standing at the bar drinking coffee. Okay, it looks quite civilized, really. Okay, so what's happening here then? It's a queue. Yeah, it's actually in Singapore, this is, but this is a Starbucks. There are other coffee outlets available. So what happened? What's the differences? Anyone ever kind of thought, are there Starbuckses in Italy? Has anyone ever thought that? Do you think there are any Starbuckses in Italy? How many? How many do you think there are? 5? There are none. Is this not interesting? Why are there no Starbucks in Italy? Hey? It's better coffee, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So these are the types of things that I walk around noticing. So what's happening here is in Singapore, this is your Starbucks experience. It's actually the experience that people in any Starbucks go through. And we can sort of see it here. So it's like you sort of walk in, you order, you pay, then you sort of stand around. Anyone notice you do a lot of standing around? And you're waiting for your coffee. And eventually you get it and you can drink it and you can sit down and you can sort of roughly see people sitting down. There's a few people sitting down, but actually everyone's just waiting. Okay, if we compare this to what's happening in Italy, okay, it's a slightly different world. And this is what I mean about when you put your design out in the world, it's sort of different in different places. And what is actually going on? So what happens in Italy is slightly different and perhaps a little bit more civilized. You order, you just stand there waiting for your order, and they give it to you, and then you pay. Seems a bit old-fashioned, actually, doesn't it, really? But actually, it's quite typical in Italy, this sort of thing. And what it means is that if you, as a tourist, anyone been to Italy? As a tourist, you walk into a coffee bar, and you order your coffee, and you hand over your money. You ever done this? Hand over your money, and the guy looks at you like, what are you doing? Like, don't embarrass me with the money, because you haven't actually had your coffee yet, okay? So what's happening here? What's happening here is there's a sort of expectation in Italy of how things work, and this is what it is, okay? Laid out for you there. That's how things work, okay? So this is like the world in which any design you put into this world in Italy needs to potentially take account of this type of thing. So if you were designing some kind of coffee shop app or service or product, it'd be good to know this sort of stuff. Whereas in Starbucks, if you were designing an app or something, anyone designed an app for Starbucks? They have one, actually, I think. They have several. But their apps kind of need to fit into this kind of understanding. Okay, I won't go into all the questions around whether Starbucks rolling this kind of model out across the world. I won't go into whether that's a good or a bad thing because we don't have time. But okay, so what we see is the outside world is a little bit more complicated than potentially we first thought, and it's different in different places. And people have these expectations which are, in a sense, kind of cultural, but they're also sort of up here. You know, we learn how a coffee shop works, and we potentially don't know that when we go somewhere different, and we make fools of ourselves, you know. But it's just sort of knowledge that we either do or don't have. Okay, and that knowledge is out there in the world, in your users' heads. And this is what we need to start sort of unpicking when we put our design out there and we think, is it going to work? Okay. So what are we really asking in this type of work? We're asking, is this thing going to be useful, and is it going to be easy to use? Okay. That's really what we want to get out of this stage. And to give you a sense of, well, what might the right product look like? I've come up with this little diagram. Really, it's all about a trade-off, okay? So this is inspired by the work of B.J. Fogg, who has a behavior model, which is all to do with motivation and that sort of thing, and how much effort it is to do things. But really, what we're talking about, or another way we can think about it, is this product useful? And is this product easy to use? Now, these are two separate things which are often not distinguished. What's happening, I think, with products that are the right product and the wrong product is that the right product in the green area is on the right side of this trade-off. And I'll give you a really quick example. So, I'm not on Tinder, but Tinder, potentially, is just such a killer product. It's super useful and it's super easy to use. So why wouldn't people go for it? They do. But then perhaps something like Skype. Anyone ever kind of noticed that Skype is a bit awkward? Yes. But it's this kind of amazingly successful product, even though it's not actually very easy to use. And why is that? Because it's useful. Whereas we have something down the bottom. The logo is probably a bit obscure, but anyone recognize that logo? Google Wave, yes. Google Wave. Probably a lot more usable than Skype, but it never really took off because the usefulness of it just wasn't there. So when they put Google Wave out, it sort of arrived in the world, and people were like, huh? You know, it was like being in that coffee shop where you hand over the money, and the guy's like, but you're not supposed to pay me now. That's what Google Wave was a bit like. Like, people were just like, huh? What does this do? They can't understand it. Even though actually it's way more usable than Skype. So in a sense, it's the wrong product. That's what I'm talking about there. Okay, so what I'm going to do quickly is just take you through a story who will give you a counterexample. So my story, a few years ago, I got involved with the Government Digital Service, and they put me onto this project to do with the Dartford crossing, and that's what I want to talk to you about briefly now. And I guess this is an example of where, well, when the design research comes a bit later than is ideal, okay, and we'll see what happens. So this is kind of when research is done after design. So if you can imagine, they sort of built out this system, and I'll tell you what it is. They built this system, and then the design research aspect of it came later. So the Dart Charge Service. So in London, they've got this big motorway, and at one point it crosses the M25. And in the old days, you used to have to actually stop and chuck £2 into a thing, a bit like the suspension bridge, which is kind of a bit dumb because you're going 70 miles an hour on the motorway. So they came up with this idea of like, well, let's put the cameras in, like the London congestion charge, and just read people's number plates so you can whiz on through. All good. Everyone speeds up. It's kind of actually a lot better now. But you now have this issue that you have to, well, how do you pay? You know, you just whiz through. There's no place to chuck your £2. So how do you pay? So we have a remote sort of payment system where you can go online and various other methods of actually paying. Puts the responsibility onto people to actually remember to pay, and that's the problem. Okay, so when this system came out maybe 2 years ago, they discovered lots of people forgetting to pay, and getting fined. So they said, well, we'll be nice about this. We'll actually just kind of send you a letter on your first offence and let you off. So here's that letter, Mr. Joe Public. Dear Joe, we'll let you off the first time you forget to pay. Okay. So that's everyone being nice to everyone else. It's all good, isn't it? Except, I'll go back to that. Except, it's like this idea with the coffee shop. How the world works is slightly different to the way this system is designed. So I don't know if I can quickly take you through this, but there's a driver, right? The driver goes over the crossing, and because of that, he or she has to pay a fee. Or if they forget, they have to pay a penalty, okay? So this is how people think it works, okay? And actually what we did, the design research we did, we just went out into Romford High Street, 2 researchers, and we interviewed a load of people and analysed what they said. And this is kind of where we got to. We got to a kind of model of this is how the world works, okay? Now, in reality, there's an issue with this system, which is fair enough, which is to protect people's privacy, to stop you just kind of going on there, typing in a number plate, and seeing where your ex-girlfriend is driving to stop that, the privacy constraint on that. People can't just go on there and type in a number plate and look up crossings. They can't do that. So to protect that, we say, well, the only way you can look up a specific crossing is if there's a penalty associated with it. So the driver has to enter some kind of penalty details, and it says, oh yeah, you know, you crossed a couple of days ago, and this is your car, so on. Now, if we imagine we've got this warning letter saying we're going to let you off, what now happens is the only way for people to identify themselves is to enter this penalty details. So people have to kind of come down here and say, yeah, I've got this penalty and you're letting me off, okay? But this is a problem, because if we go back to remind ourselves that how people think the world works, we have a relationship between the driver and the crossing, okay? But actually what we're saying to people is, to get let off, go into the penalty bit. And of course people just like, huh? This isn't like, I'm expecting to just find my crossing and pay, and to see that the actual penalty is scrubbed. So we have an expectation, like in the coffee shop with paying, we have an expectation that you just somehow find your crossing, and then you just pay the fee and the penalty's scrubbed, okay? Now the way of fixing this, I'm sure you can think of different ways of fixing this. It's not actually that difficult to fix this, really. But what it means is there's a problem, and the problem is going against people's mental models here is causing something in the region of about £100,000 a month in people that just don't believe it. So they get this letter and they're like, you're letting me off, but you're saying I need to go and sort of look up my penalty. They just don't believe it. They can't believe it, and so they just ring up. They refuse to do it online, and they ring up, and it's costing about £100,000 a month in support costs on the phone. And that's not even including the time and hassle for those people. So if you do this design research, you can take out these sorts of problems. Okay. I'll hand over to Carl, who's going to talk about when research is done before design, and he'll give you an example from his world.
Yeah. All right, thanks. So I'll just kind of, little spoiler, this was a great project. It was a while ago. I'm going to take you back to the year 2000. So just like some of the tech we're seeing looks a little old-fashioned. So this was like one of the operating systems at the time, pre-iPhone, probably pre-mobile phones for a lot of us. The consumer operating system, I looked this up, was Windows ME, if anybody remembers this, which preceded XP. Anyway, so years 2000, the reason I'm going back so far is that this is just was a really nice example of a client that wanted to do design research and some nice things that came out of it. So I'm kind of going back in the history books, but it's just a really nice example. So Deltec was a company based in Minnesota. They had a bunch of technology that was mostly for administering IV medication in hospital situations. This was their existing product. And for a lot of reasons, they wanted to take this technology and enter a new market, which was insulin pump for diabetics. So very quickly, if you don't know anything about it, these diabetes pumps are fairly small. They have a little bit of insulin. Diabetes is a disease where your body's not producing insulin, so you can either inject yourself or these pumps can administer insulin. And there's actually a lot of benefits to these little pumps, which I'm not going to get into, but they do require that the user pretty much wear them 24/7. So instead of injecting themselves, the pump is slowly administering insulin into your body, simply similar to the way your body normally would if it was functioning properly. At the time, these were the pumps that were kind of on the market. So, I mean, these were sort of by engineers for engineers, right? We're looking at like Lego bricks and Star Wars kind of devices, you know. The interfaces on the devices kind of looked something like this. I've got one of these on my thermostat at home, and I can't use it. Perhaps you've seen things like this before. The language that was used on these pumps was, you know, very technical, very medical, just hard to understand. So when Deltec wanted to enter this market, they came to us and they said, look, we understand the hospital market, we know what their needs are, but we think we have the technology to do this product, but we don't understand our users that well, so could you help us out? So they commissioned, actually, it turned out to be a two-phase design research. They started off with phase one to kind of go into the field and start talking to people. So They had contacts in a few places. This kind of community in the US is largely run by these certified diabetes educators, the pump educators who work with the diabetics to kind of help them use their pumps and manage their diabetes. So phase one, we really just went out and talked to people. Phase one was probably 4 to, we'll call it 6 weeks, half of this. And what we did is we asked people to take photos of their home situation. We kind of did interviews, and then we did this collaging exercise, which I'll get into. So I'm just gonna show you some of the images that we saw. And what we were really just listening, you know, what's your home like? What's your life with diabetes like? What things about the pump are important to you? And there was a lot of material generated, so I'm skipping across a lot of it, but I'm just gonna hit a couple points just to kind of give you the gist. So one of the issues is that people have to change a lot of things with this pump. There's these tube sets, there's a lot of sterile materials, so people were doing this at the kitchen table when their dogs were running around and the kids were getting off to school and their wife's making breakfast and their beeper's going off, whatever it is. You know, here's a desktop setting. I mean, essentially what we started hearing about was not, you know, I need to program these extra, you know, temporary boluses and 0.1 blah, blah, blah unit, you know, power settings. People were like, look, this is a pain in my ass. You know, here I am trying to change this thing on the kitchen sink, which is not sterile. How do I wear this thing? What do I do with it when I'm sleeping? What about when I'm on my first date and we're getting intimate and I'm gonna have sex? How do I wear it in the office? Can I tuck this thing in my bra? What if I wanna wear a nice dress? You know, these were, what we heard was over and over, these were the things that they were concerned about. After the interviews and the photographs, we took them into a collaging exercise. So collaging basically disengages the rational part of the brain and engages the creative side of the brain. So we literally threw magazines on the desk, everyone sitting there looking like a preschooler, cutting them up, making these collages. Then you take the collages and you put them up on the wall and you have people speak to them. So when they start speaking to them, they're like, oh, so this is my best case scenario, right? This is me running, I'm free, I'm set free from this chain, I'm looking beautiful, I'm going out to a party, I'm not thinking about things, I'm having a great time. Here, you know, oh, this is me chained to my diabetes and chained to my pump, and I'm worried that I'm not gonna be alive when my grandkids are here. You know, I'm getting thrown in prison, you know, the doctor's yelling at me. So we kind of got at some of the emotional fears and hopes and desires that were underlying some of these practical needs. And we looked at, we threw out a whole bunch of, so in phase two, after we'd heard this, we talked to the client and they said, well, can you go back and check some of this? So we went out, we threw out a whole bunch of different features. Well, what about this, what about that? I'm just showing you sort of one of maybe 60 or 70 features that we just threw out randomly to be like, what's important to you? And what we really heard was like, we want to be able to treat ourselves and we really want to live, you know, as easily as we can. And all this, you know, the harder, better, faster, stronger, more that everyone's pitching, you know, we believe these pumps work. They're gonna work for us, but we have these lives that are very important to us. So kind of coming out of this, what did we do? Well, we designed a pump to not look like a brick. We intentionally gave it a very playful appearance. We gave them different colors. This is actually an integrated clip-on blood glucose meter, which actually interfaced with the pump. I think it was the first sort of integrated unit. And it was a little kludgy, you know, again, this is like 15 years ago and we'll see what happens later. But so design, color, features. We made it waterproof so people could shower or swim in it. Kids waterproofing is a big deal because they're always running around at the beach. We gave them a plain language interface. You know, now we have touch screens, but at the time, this was actually sort of state of the art. We tried to use simple language in all the documentation and the manuals, just speak to them as if they were real live people. You know, one of the quotes, I was looking through it last night, is like, treat us like people, not like patients. We tried to make it playful and friendly. And we wound up with a lot of really, really happy customers. You know, there's a big core. And unfortunately, the company was bought out and the product was taken off the market in sort of 5 to 7 years. But the whole time we were there, we had a great client. The client was really excited and delighted, and we had a fantastic relationship with them. So 15 years later, and I'm going to start wrapping this up because we're getting close on time, but the whole this is the Johnson & Johnson product. They own Animas. The whole world has kind of moved into this life, so we see people camping, water fights, right? The world's moved in this direction. The IP and features were sold off to Tandem. What is this? I want people to know that I can live my life. I just have to take care of my diabetes. People now have wireless glucose monitors that talk to their pumps, so this is just a really great thing for the users. And me, 15 years later, I get to sit here and really feel happy that I felt I left the world a bit of a better place than when we started this project. And that's really meaningful to me. And I think everyone on this project felt the same way. The summary, and then we'll start wrapping it up.
Okay. Okay, so what we've seen is design research can help address the real problem. So Carl's been talking about how the real problem is making people feel like they can lead a normal life with diabetes. It's not the technology per se. Design research can help make design easier, so we know what we're actually doing, and we don't get those problems of it turns out differently, or we just start anyway. It lowers the risk of sucking. It takes these crap products and projects, takes them away. Helps us get it right first time. So we see, like the story I told you, where something got missed there, and it costs £1 million a year. And as Carl said, he genuinely feels he's made the world a better place, and I honestly think I do too. So, yeah. But, and there's always buts, will clients admit their brief is incomplete? Will clients pay for research on the real problem? It's not real work, is it? You're not actually coding anything. And, they just want to get on with it because, it's really important that it gets done. And, they're I guess, expert in the business, and we're experts in coding, making projects. So, just get on with it. We know enough already, right? But, and this perhaps is an interesting one. If you leave these problems, if we just get going, assume a whole bunch of stuff, and we think, well, we'll fix these kind of design problems later, it gets a lot more expensive, okay? So if we fix them at the very beginning, let's imagine that costs us kind of one of something. It gets up to 30 times more expensive if you leave it to the end. So it kind of means sort out what the real problems are before you spend your budget. Get started. Okay, how do we get started? Really quickly. Can we have 1 more minute? Yeah. So how do we get started? A quick couple of techniques from the two of us. I don't expect that maybe we'll do this in any depth, but the thing that I did with this warning letter, really what I'm doing here was something called guerrilla interviews, and in a sense, I just turned up somewhere random in public, potentially a library. I said, is it all right if I just kind of talk to people? And I had a little patter to say what I was doing. This is what I'm doing. Can you help me? And stopped people at random. And I was asking them about their understanding of how the world works, how sort of driving over this crossing, forgetting, how does the world work? And that's what I was aiming for, some sense from them of how the world works. Okay. A resource that you can look up that's really quite handy is something on the GovUK service manual. It's called the discovery phase. And really, you can check that out. And what you can learn about is this bit at the bottom. You shouldn't start building your service in discovery. So this is like a moment to investigate before you build stuff. And Carl.
Yeah, I'm just going to race through the last couple of slides, but collaging I already talked about. I think the real point is there are some techniques out there that are a little bit more advanced, so by all means, go talk to people. That's by far the most important thing. Get out of your office. There are things you can do. IDEO's got a really interesting thing called Design Kit online that has a whole bunch of techniques, and there's also lots and lots of other stuff if you're interested. Again, the question is, how much do you want to learn yourself? How much do you want to get someone else to do it? But there are ways to do this out in the world is the point. So we have just a couple like thoughts, right? So what do you do with all this stuff? So our thought was like, we're all here building things. So what do you do? Challenge the brief, right? If you see something that looks weird, if you don't believe in it, ask questions, challenge, say, are you sure you know what you're talking about? Go talk to some people and then tell the client what they said. So just make sure you do something and present it. You're almost certainly gonna learn something that's useful. And if you do, then you might get asked to do a bit more. Really, you found, they said what? Really, you found, they said what? Discuss the risk of not doing it. Hey, you're gonna spend £1 million. You're gonna spend £250,000. Really, do you really not wanna do like a week or 2 weeks, even just checking? And kind of try and break, like, this is too expensive, it's gonna take too, like, look, hey, it's only gonna take us a day or two to go ask a few questions. All right, that's it. All right, that's it. Questions? No questions. Someone's got a question. Darwin's got a question. Oh. Perfect. Come on up here with me. Oh, actually, here, let's.
At the beginning of the talk and at the end of the talk, you suggested that one of the main drivers was the expense of late changes. However, the technique seems to have value regardless. Do you think that if you made late changes much less expensive, you would alter or change the process?
Mind if I take that? Sure. Well, so I think that there are a huge number of kind of techniques for testing as you go through the entire process right now. So A/B and all kinds. So some people are doing testing every 2 weeks and sort of agile design testing. So I think the cost of testing as you go actually has been dramatically lowered because of kind of improved process. I think for me, what I would say is that fundamentally, if you don't do that research at the beginning, you can A, miss huge opportunities that you just weren't even thinking of, and B, you may actually just help yourself a ton by sort of starting off in the right ballpark. So yeah, if you start off in the wrong place and you do all this testing as you go, you may eventually wind up in that right ballpark potentially. But boy, that is just the dumbest way to do it. Right? It's like, go find out what people need, try and build that, and then, of course, do all that testing as you go. So, I mean, I think that you can test your way into doing this right, but it is, as far as I'm concerned, it's a terrible way of doing it. And you may just miss something fundamentally that's not uncovered by testing.
I guess all I'd add to that is potentially the later you do it, what if you're on the wrong track? So what if you're just optimizing, improving, fixing something which isn't addressing the full problem? I think that's the risk. So you end up with a product that's kind of, usable, but actually it's not very useful, and then you get the Google wave, I think.
Oh, hold on, wait for the microphone. And then we'll go to the guy in the back.
Certain large companies, and won't name names, but it's in their interest almost to get it wrong and screw people like the government later on maintenance, because they make a lot of money that way. So how do you change that culture, especially in big IT government contracts where there's a vested interest not to get it right almost?
Well, certainly in the public sector, everyone's encouraged to do discovery work, so there's a huge amount of that going on. But yeah, just takes time, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think in the commercial world, there's that imperative of like, we just need to get something out there, and even if it's slightly broken, who cares? That's probably, is that life? Maybe that's just life. It's hard to push back on that. But I guess what we're wanting you guys to go away with today is a sense of like, is your project just going to kind of rush into something which is sort of not as good as it could be?
And I'd say I think you're talking about something that has to be addressed at a higher level management issue. You know, if higher level management it intentionally wants to do something like that, I think it's tough to address at the design level. We can give people the tools to not do that accidentally. But I think your question is probably maybe better addressed at a sort of C-level executive suite or something along those lines. I'm not sure I have the answer to it. I said the guy in the back could go next, but you want to just shout out?
Sir, I guess I had a question about, in terms of what you're proposing is really getting to the heart of the business problem, but sometimes it's the new technology that provokes a shift in mental models. So, for example, you know, my family definitely didn't need a tablet device until I bought them an iPad, and now I can't really ever get it off them. So I guess there's how can you explore how a new technology might shift those mental models? Do you see what I mean? And without actually building the technology and delivering it to them. Because knowing whether or not that's going to remotely hit the barn door before you've actually gone to all the expense of building it and that kind of thing would be, because Google Wave is perhaps a good example of that. They were trying to completely rethink email, and actually it didn't work.
Well, so I'd say there are two things. So first of all, the design research is not going to tell you what you need to design. The design research is going to tell you what people want, what their needs are, what their underlying emotions are. And then as designers, or builders, it's our job to then take those and translate them into a product. And that's tricky. I'm not going to go into it at great length, but I will just say that in the hardware world, because I have a fair amount of experience there are a whole bunch of techniques to kind of prototype and test, you know, hardware prototypes way before you've spent the entire budget. It is tricky, but people have amazing imaginations, and if you give them something to play with and touch that's a fake or even paper, they will often fill in the blanks, and so there is quite a bit of work you can do, but there's still failures. Apple built the Newton. I mean, I think if you go back in time, the Palm Pilot was actually one of the very successes at that, but it's tricky. There are ways of doing it, but probably a little bit too far for me to go into right at the moment.
Maybe I'd just add to, should we take another one? Or? Okay, one more question here.
James, front row.
Yeah, very briefly, it's very easy to bias your potential customer. You know, if you're trying to fact find and you're not good at this stuff and you haven't done it before, but you're keen to get some intel. Are there any tricks you would give us for, you know, getting in and actually getting access to the information you need, rather than saying, "What do you think of my cool product idea? Is this going to be brilliant?"
Well, I guess the key point is, in an ideal world, we do this before we do any design work, so there is no sort of thing.
But you've still got a concept you're working towards. You're
yeah.
But the initial design research may be done before you show them any concepts. You show
but
them nothing.
my point, like,
Later
how do you
on.
start a conversation with somebody without biasing them is really my...
Okay. So let's say there's a concept, right? There's something that you're kind of wanting to do. So to avoid biasing them, you find some way of saying, this is the boundary. This is the space in which, you know, I want to understand how you think. And maybe our concept is in that space, you know, whether that's parking or conferences or whatever the kind of domain is, the area of interest. And in some way we just frame that and say, I'm really interested in how you understand this topic. And the fact that you've got a concept that you're being offered money to build this thing, you just keep that to yourself. And you what you're doing is trying to understand how they think this world works, in which your concept potentially will arrive.
Just ask open-ended questions. What does it look like when you go to have a coffee? What does it look like when you get ready for work and you have diabetes? You know, open-ended questions, that's where you start. So more or less what he said.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep,
Okay.
so just a big thank
Thank you.